Good evening, everyone. My name is Tiera Ndlovu, and I'm a curatorial assistant here at the Norton Museum of Art. I'm the curator of Origin Stories, Photography of Africa and Its Diaspora, the museum's most recent photography exhibition. For those of you who may not know, the Norton has 5 formal collecting interests: American art, Chinese art, European art, contemporary art, and photography. But as we'll begin to explore tonight, the Norton's holdings are not confined to what these categories suggest on the surface. Particularly within the photography collection, artists from around the globe are represented. So there's Caribbean art represented, African artists represented, and there's art from artists across the Asian continent. I think it's really important to let those global perspectives shine through as we expand the kinds of stories we share with the community here at the museum. The undercurrent of the exhibition and the focus of my discussion with you tonight lies in exploring how contemporary photographers address the legacy of colonialism in African and African diasporic communities. Origin Stories is a continuation of shows here at the Norton that brings representation to the forefront of our dialogue. Some that come to mind are For the Record, the Recognition of Art by Women exhibition series, and the forthcoming exhibition on Mexican modernism. And on that note of fostering representation in all that we do, I want to give a very special shout out to our designer, Lorraine Bond. Lorraine's expertise and insight allowed us to include African creatives in the exhibition design as well, with the typeface we used. So the font that you see in the show's title here was created as a partnership between Noel Pretorius, Maria Ramos, Design Indaba, which is a South African-based design company, and South African dancer Andil Vellum. And I think this is one of the coolest things ever. The movements of vellum create the base of the font. So to me, that's really beautiful, and it's one of the finishing touches that made this project so exciting over the last few months. So I've shared a little bit about how we got the design of the show, but what about the art, right? What works make up Origin Stories, Photography of Africa and Its Diaspora? Before diving into that, I'd like to take a moment to define what we mean when we say Africa and its diaspora. By definition, a diaspora is the dispersion of any people from their original homeland. The African diaspora emerged as a result of colonialism specifically. It developed as over 8 million Africans were forcefully displaced from their home countries to the Americas, the Caribbean, and Europe through the transatlantic slave trade from the 16th to the 19th century. I know that the horror of the transatlantic slave trade is not new news to anyone here, but I'd like to offer a visual of just how many people were enslaved and where the majority of those enslaved went. This is a time lapse from a project called Slave Voyages that shows slave ships traveling from the African continent, and as you'll see, primarily from West Africa, from the late 1500s to the late 1860s. As we watch, I'd like you to take note of 2 things: the color and the size of the dots you see. Green dots are for ships owned by the Portuguese, primarily traveling to the colony of Brazil. Red dots are ships owned by Great Britain, traveling to the Caribbean and North America. Blue ships are for France, who also had colonies across the Caribbean and North America. Additional colors come about, and you'll see the keys right here at the bottom. And the larger the dot, the larger the vessel, and therefore the more individuals that were captured. The transatlantic slave trade lasted until 1866. It was well over 300 years, and as we just saw, there was an overwhelming amount of Africans displaced from across the continent. I hope that this video begins to put things in perspective for our discussion tonight. The descendants of those who were enslaved make up what we know as the African diaspora. The diaspora is now, by force, a transnational community, but as we begin to see in the art, those in the diaspora are reconnecting with their origins, and in doing so, preserving aspects of African cultural identity and heritage. Yet as straightforward as that reconnection may sound, due to the nature of the slave trade and the formation of the diaspora, it's difficult. The challenge is perhaps best captured by a quote from Yinka Shonibare, one of the artists featured in the exhibition, who says, "Is there such a thing as pure origin? For those of the post-colonial generation, this is a very difficult thing to answer." Using Shonibare's quote as a catalyst, let's begin to explore the exhibition, keeping in mind how the artists featured are confronting the legacy of colonialism. Fortunately, because of the smaller, intimate size of the show, I get the pleasure of going through the installation almost piece by piece with you. In the exhibition space, there's no denying the presence and influence of Yinka Shonibare's Les Méduses. To start, it's a monumental size, as the largest work in the show, measuring 7 feet tall and just under 9 feet wide. And I've gotten a lot of questions beforehand about this work, wondering if it's a print or a painting or some combination of both. It is a photo of a sculpture, also by Shonibare, and when it was originally exhibited, both the sculpture and the print were shown together. Les Méduses is based on the shipwreck of a French warship of the same name. The French vessel, Méduse, set sail in 1816, transporting ammunition and military personnel to reestablish French colonial rule in Senegal, but the vessel wrecked off the coast of northwestern Africa during its journey. The incident of the Méduse was also portrayed in 1818 by French painter Théodore Géricault in his famous work, The Raft of the Medusa, where Géricault depicts survivors of the shipwreck wavering at sea on the remains of the ship's deck. The textiles that Shonibare uses for the ship's sails are strongly associated with Africa. However, they are actually Dutch wax fabrics imported from Europe to West African colonies in the 19th century. By adorning the doomed ship with these fabrics, the artist moves beyond a visual narration of the Medusa's demise, begun by Géricault, and imbues the scene with a critique of European colonial conquest. There's something incredibly interesting when you think of the story in that sense. It's a tragedy because there was this loss of life when the ship wrecked. But on the other hand, and rather simultaneously, the French colonization of Western Africa also resulted in tragedies. That duality of history is something that has captivated me for quite a while and is an aspect I wanted to focus on throughout the exhibition. The difficult sides of history are often swept away, perhaps to make the history easier to discuss. But as difficult as it is to talk about that history, it hasn't just gone away. It remains, and it should be considered. And as Shonibare states, his work reinterprets moments of colonial history in a witty, in a sort of knowing way. What Shonibare is hinting at is to fully understand the message, even at times to fully understand his irony, you must consider the full story. So ultimately, he's encouraging deep reflection and moving past just admiring the formal composition of the work. Les Méduses predates some of Shonibare's most well-known public works, like Nelson's Ship in a Bottle, where Shonibare continues to approach moments of colonial history with a critical eye. Similar to Les Méduses, Nelson's Ship in a Bottle considers the social impacts of European colonial wars. Modeled after HMS Victory, a British Navy vessel in the 18th century, Shonibare considers the violence and tragedy experienced as a result of the expansion of the British Empire, made in part possible through Admiral Nelson's victories at sea. Both works constitute a pivotal point in Shonibare's career, where he begins to engage with the idea of pairing history with his personal views on decolonization. Like the work of Shonibare, Leah Gordon produces work in and of Haiti that also reinterprets moments of art history and racial prejudice. This is the caste portraits. A caste system is a class structure that is determined by characteristics given at birth. For colonial societies, in the Americas and the Caribbean particularly, caste systems developed based solely on race. And in the colonial race-based caste system, individuals were placed in a hierarchy based on their skin color, where lighter tones were superior to darker tones. This diagram is from the 18th century, and it shows las castas as used in Mexico. But whether it was the system in Mexico or the system in Haiti where Gordon created her work, the underlying hierarchy that perpetuates the idea that superiority equates to whiteness remains the same. Gordon's modern-day interpretation of the caste critiqued the superficial classification system by reversing the order completely, placing darker skin tones on top, superior to the lighter ones. Together, these portraits convey a powerful visual statement about the ways in which race was used to determine class status in colonies across the Caribbean and the Americas, and prompts us to challenge how this continues to impact modern societies. Gordon is also reimagining European art history in this work. She's posing her sitters in the likeness of many Renaissance paintings. I believe most of us will recognize the similarities to the portrait of Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife by Jan van Eyck. But there are far more. Sorry. And as we see, some of these are very clearly reiterations of the earlier works, whereas others simply include similar motifs, like the rosary in her hand in this image, and the branch in hand here. It's also very interesting to note that Gordon herself is inserted at the end of the spectrum, and the first portrait is of her partner. Another artist who is addressing the impacts of racial prejudice on access and opportunities is Pinar Yolocan. This portrait from the Maria series was taken in Itapirica Island in Brazil. The nearest city to the island is Salvador, the country's fourth largest city. And before independence, when Brazil was a Portuguese colony, Salvador was the capital city. As the center of the colony, Salvador was the location of the first slave market in Brazil, and in fact, the first in the Americas. So Salvador has a particularly tainted history when it comes to colonialism. If you recall the time lapse at the beginning of my presentation, then here's a static version of that map. A large number of those enslaved were transported to Brazil. Estimates rest at over 3 million. So in this series, Yolocan features Afro-Brazilian women, that is, women who are the descendants of those enslaved in Brazil. And she combines her sitta's attire of colonial-inspired dress with animal remains that she bought at the Central Market in Salvador. Admittedly, it's very grotesque in nature to drape these women with internal organs of dead animals, yet it's Yolocan's way of recalling and confronting the role of Salvador in the Portuguese colony in the transatlantic slave trade. Hopping over to an artist who recalls the history of slavery here in the southern US, Carrie Mae Weems. In the installation, I selected 2 works by Weems, a work from the Sea Island series, seen on the right, and From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried on the left. In both works, Weems pairs photography with poetic text as she mines through the heritage of the African diaspora in the United States. Through the Sea Island series, Weems documents historical homes of the Gullah community that reside in the coastal regions of North and South Carolina, Georgia, and North Florida. In the text titled The House, Weems shares an African folklore ritual for cleansing and maintaining a new home, a practice that is still observed by many members of the Gullah community today. And From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried, Weems appropriates this 19th century photograph of a man named Gordon, also known as Whipped Peter. Gordon was enslaved in Louisiana, but successfully escaped to a Union Army camp in March 1863. Just 3 months after the Proclamation of Emancipation declared that all persons held as slaves in the United States were to be freed. Union Army doctors medically examined Gordon and documented the extensive keloid scars on his back, a result of being whipped. The text Weems transposes over Gordon's image critiques the hollow promise of change following emancipation. Her inscription also pays homage to 2 African-American musicians, Duke Ellington and Billie Holiday, the latter of which is known for her cover of Strange Fruit, a powerful song that pleads for justice for victims of lynching in the American South. Another powerhouse of the diaspora in this show is Ana Mendieta. The 2 works shown here are from her Silhouette series. Mendieta described this series as a response to feeling, quote, having been cast from the womb, end quote. Paralleling the displacement felt through the African diaspora, Mendieta used spiritual practices to contend with her personal history, as she was forced from Cuba at a young age, following the Cuban Revolution. The series draws heavily from Santeria, an Afro-Cuban religion based on the Nigerian heritage religion of Ifa, and in part influenced by Catholicism. Santeria as a religious practice was born out of exile and slavery, and the expressions of the religion come in the form of rituals. While Mendieta was never a member of the religion, she recalls witnessing Santeria ceremonies as a child growing up in Cuba. The Silhouette works are a record of Mendieta's dialogue with Santeria practices as she navigated themes of the female body and the landscape as a way to connect with her homeland while living abroad. This is a work by another Afro-Cuban artist, René de Jesus Peña González, who works and lives in Cuba. González is known for his black and white photography, a choice that was originally practical, as it was the only material available in Cuba, but has since become an aesthetic choice. His sitters are also often shown in fragments, like the lips we see here. In doing so, González is removing the markers of who this individual is and what their background may be. To that end, this work symbolically speaks to the underlying idea of the exhibition, that one's origin, once removed, or in this case fragmented, is complicated to trace. Thus far, I focused on works by artists living in the diaspora, but I'd like to shift now to focus on works by artists working or living on the African continent. This work is by Malick Sidibé. This print actually features the original paper frame used by the artist. When Sidibé opened his studio in Bamako, the capital city of Mali, it was around the time that Mali gained independence following French colonial rule. His photographs show modern West African social life, and he's often described as the eye of Bamako, as he captured both candid and studio-based scenes in the years of post-independence. One of my favorite quotes by Sidibé reads, "It's a world, someone's face. When I capture it, I see the future of the world." And in this work, I see 3 individuals that might come together to signify his outlook of the world. We have a mother who is of the generation that grew up under colonial rule, the daughter, that present coming-of-age generation, and the son, the future generation. Next to Sidibé's work in the gallery space is a portrait by J.D. Okai Ojikere, and there are some fascinating parallels between Sidibé and Ojikere's artistic practices. Ojikere began his career capturing scenes of Nigerian social and cultural life in the decades following the nation's independence from the United Kingdom. So Sidibé, there was independence from France, and here it's from the UK. As a part of the generation that lived through the transition from colonial rule to independence, Ojikere had a desire to preserve aspects of traditional Nigerian culture, particularly women's hairstyles. Indigenous women of West Africa styled their hair to signify social markers such as marital status, ethnic origins, and socioeconomic class. After independence, Ojikere witnessed a revival of these indigenous hairstyles as Nigerian women began to actively distance themselves from Western beauty standards. The exhibition also features work by Delphine Fuwandu, who some of you may remember was nominated for the Norton's Rudin Prize for Emerging Photographers in 2014. There are 3 works in total by Fuwandu in the show. This first one is at the entry point of the exhibition. It's titled The African Dream, Bamako, Mali, where the artist stages an everyday, intimate home scene that engages with the ethos of the American dream, which is the idea that freedom is equated to the opportunity for equal prosperity and success. And so here we have Fuwandu seated alone as she questions or perhaps contemplates and grapples with understanding and quantifying what could be the African dream. Growing up as a first-generation American to parents from West Africa, Fuwandu's work draws upon her hybrid cultural upbringing. Fuwandu works in the US and in multiple countries on the African continent as she investigates how indigenous African cultures have, quote, transformed and shape-shifted within the African diaspora, end quote. In the other works featured, Fuwandu adopts the dress of the Maasai tribe, a community that inhabits Kenya and Tanzania. As this character, Fuwandu explores the tension between the traditional and the modern, the latter of which has been greatly impacted by Western culture. Maasai to the present, Nairobi, Kenya, exemplifies Fuwandu's dialogue with Africa's colonial past and independent present. Posed in front of a graffitied bus stop, Fuwandu is shown evolving, or perhaps regressing, between indigenous and contemporary attire. You'll see the center figure adopts characteristics of both, sporting a traditional headpiece and accessories with the modern ensemble of jeans, a pink t-shirt, and flip-flops. And in all these works, Fuwandu is the only person photographed. She plays every character. And what lingers with me when I look at these images is Fuwandu's exploration of self-portraiture. To me, it really begs the question, how do we perceive others in relation to ourselves? Valerie Belin and the artist collective, the Shavlam Sisters, engage with a similar line of questioning. How do we see each other? Belin is a prominent French photographer, best known for her experiments with light in her photographic practice. This portrait, which captures her sightline from Richard's gallery, is from a series where Belin features Black women in Paris. This work lies at the intersection of portraiture and editorial photography, as Belin sought to celebrate the beauty of her sitter's skin while still manipulating the photographic medium to produce a light that seems to emerge artificially from the skin. The Shavlam Sisters consist of Paris-based twins Delphine and Elodie, each photograph from the In Dog We Trust series, of which these works are a part, is embossed with a unique hand-stenciled pattern that is stamped into the negative space of the photograph. I encourage you after our talk to visit the gallery if you haven't already, just to see these in person. Santa Larazas on the right shows a young breakdancer performing outside of a metro station in Paris. And Arona on the left is the name of the photographer photographed at a contemporary dance festival in Cotonou, the largest city in the Republic of Benin, a former French colony. Together, these works showcase a refreshing view of the diaspora. They are moments of celebrating beauty, joy, and in the case of the Shavlam Sisters, dance. Altogether, Origin Stories, Photography of Africa and Its Diaspora, not only offers a narrative of the African diasporic experience, but the artists and work represented here disrupt cultural histories that are rooted in colonialism. I'm so happy that I could share some of the most captivating aspects of this show with you tonight. This is my first show here at the Norton, and I'm so grateful that I got the opportunity to take a deep dive into our photography collection and showcase the depth of the museum's holdings. I'm more than happy to answer any specific questions you may have now, and thank you for coming.